Thank you for the chance to speak today. I'm Martin Howell. I'm the Director of Transport Markets for the UK and Ireland here at Worldline. We are a payment services provider, and we also have a long heritage in transport and especially rail in this country, with systems and services supporting every aspect of the operations of the nation's railways. I was especially pleased to be asked to talk on this topic because in an age of dizzying change, compounded and confused by the pandemic, it's easy to forget that first and foremost, our transport network should be for everyone, not purely for some socially responsible ideal, although, as I'll come to, that is critically important. No, it's actually for the simple economic reason that without customers, our transport networks will rapidly decline, with serious consequences for the future of the country. Transport's critical to social mobility, which typically means access to education and employment opportunities. Now, there can be absolutely no doubt that an efficient, affordable, multimodal transport network is a fundamental ingredient in economic recovery and growth. The much heralded ambition of levelling up and the Bus Back Better strategy can only be achieved with a thriving and efficient transport system. Our transport networks have been hit hard in lockdown and have to recover, meaning that they must be made as attractive as possible to all, since, as I've already said, they can't survive without a critical mass of paying customers. Now, the question for the industry and government is not just how to get people back using public and shared transport again, it's also how to get people out of their cars. Right now, on average, across most developed countries, over 70% of personal journeys are still made by private car. Unless we can find a way to get people out of those cars in substantial numbers and onto public and shared transport, we will not be addressing the key issue. So, how do we make public and shared transport optimally attractive to people? Well, I would say that buses and trains need to honour what we call the time promise. It's the number one issue for people, repeatedly coming up in surveys. That's not just, is my bus or train on time, but is it coming at a time that's convenient for me? And most importantly, will it get me where I need to be when it says it will? And to make a service run on time, you need to know, amongst other things, how many people want to use it, where they are, and whether you have the staff in place on time to operate it. That, of course, is all about data. So what will help to get people travelling using our transport networks again? Well, it's a number of factors. They need to be accessible. People need to be able to find and use services at a time that's appropriate for their needs. They need to be easy to use. They need to be easy to understand. And they need to be easy to pay for. People are used to ease and simplicity in all their other retail transactions. The world of entertainment has shifted dramatically to the subscription model. And if you think about Netflix and Spotify, those are perfect examples. People are conditioned to expect ease and convenience. So why is public transport so different? Why can't you choose your journey, knowing you've got the best price, and just swipe or tap to buy? Technically it's doable, but we don't. Why not? To be fair, the bus industry is probably well ahead of rail in ease of use and ease of payment, with contactless EMV widely accepted. There was an Economist story in September last year using DFT statistics that showed that rail is still overwhelmingly a middle-class mode of transport and becoming more so. In 2019, adults in the top earnings quintile travelled on average 1,400 miles each by train, 5 times more than adults in the bottom quintile. We have to reverse that trend if rail, as the centre of a transport revolution, is to fulfil its potential to be an engine of social mobility and inclusion. Making it cheaper to use and easier to understand and access will go a long way to help. So in essence, the question of inclusivity boils down to 2 critical elements: data and technology, by which I mean data on what customers really want and need, and the technology for customers to understand and access the widest range of options, as well as being communicated with about those options. And that is the paradox when thinking about wealth, economic factors, and how we ensure inclusion. Technology is both the challenge and the answer. We'll come back to that shortly. So what are the facts about financial and technological exclusion? How big is the problem? Well, if you Google digital and financial exclusion, and the irony of that is not lost on me, and some interesting facts emerge. 76% of adults have a smartphone, a number which rises to 99% among 16 to 24-year-olds. 97% of UK adults have some form of bank account, and as of December last year, there were over 83 million contactless debit cards in the UK. That would suggest to me, A, that it's possible to create a data-driven transport network with integrated bus and rail at its core, but B, that the very people who need to benefit most are not able to access it to the fullest degree. There's clearly a swathe of people, not necessarily older, but particularly in rural areas, who cannot use or do not have access to digital facilities. Last year, Pocket, a digital current account provider, calculated that without a bank account, you are likely to spend £485 a year more on bills and services than someone who did. If we are to succeed in putting fair, smart and efficient transport and all its benefits at the centre of levelling up, then such facilities must be available to the very demographics and communities least equipped to be able to exploit them, or we risk the divide getting worse. Isolation would be more pronounced and the lack of opportunity more acute. The problem is widely recognised, clearly identified, but solutions, you will not be surprised to hear me say, are less forthcoming. I'd argue that we are unlikely to completely solve the problem, but we can take some simple steps to reduce the levels of inclusion, and I'll talk about those at the end. You might think it's perverse to ask someone from a digitally driven payment services enterprise to talk about how we can empower those who don't use digital services. But I believe digital empowerment can improve services for everyone. Let me explain. Let's think about the data first. Currently, transport providers' understanding of their customers' behaviour is patchy. Some know more than others, especially in fields like ride sharing and app-driven rentals. But the key modes of bus and rail are still hampered by not having any real clear insight into customer behaviour, travel patterns or preferences. If we can begin to use data, linking how people pay for their travel with how they then use those services, we can begin to truly understand what our networks should be doing. And that yields the opportunity to make those services much more demand responsive. Of course, I know that demand responsive transport has had some false starts, but I'd contend that one of the main reasons was because the operators didn't have sufficient knowledge of and insight into customer behaviour. Linking payment and movement data promises transformational service improvement. Of course, data is already being used in timetabling decisions and service planning. All decisions are data-based to one extent or another. But really, we're still only scratching the surface, and so much of what we do is reactive. Whereas with the right data and the means to communicate its meaning and consequences to the people who need to know, we could actually get ahead of the curve and begin to influence how transport works like never before, rather than waiting to see what it'll do and having to react. So the truth is we could be doing so much more. If we could have people trust us with their data, we can begin to develop a previously unheard of level of insight. Bus and train operators will be able to understand where their customers are coming from and ultimately going to, and probably make increasingly informed decisions about why. And you can then begin to provide meaningful incentives to people to change their patterns of behaviour. Firstly, so that demand can be evened out across a constricted transport infrastructure, as is the case in most Western nations, but also so that their travel experience can be optimised. And it's precisely those potential incentives that will help us to solve the issue of getting more people out of their cars. We can show them that there are viable alternatives to private car use for many routine journeys and incentivise them to make that leap. Of course, I'd readily recognise that progress has been made and that part of what I'm talking about can be done now, but it isn't joined up and it's only personalised in quite a limited way. I guess my point is, with the right data sets analysed intelligently, over time you can begin to make increasingly accurate predictions about how people will be travelling, and of course how transport systems are operating and how they will operate and react to incidents, well before you reach a point of criticality. This potentially affords the opportunity to communicate alternative routes, for example, when services are disrupted. Much of what I've talked about is encapsulated in the philosophy behind mobility as a service, or MaaS, whose imminent arrival seems to have been trumpeted for years, although actual real achievement on the ground seems less apparent, at least here in the UK. That phrase seems to mean a lot of different things to different people, covering everything from e-scooters and flying taxis to the first and last mile principle. And in truth, these are probably all part of the mix, since one thing has been apparent to me for a long time. There is no one size fits all MaaS solution. What I do believe, however, is that a truly data-led integrated bus and train network would sit right at the heart of an ideal MaaS or mobility as a service system. If we can get those basic principles right, a transport network that's easy to access, simple to pay for, understood by all who would use it, affordable for everyone, and driven by data-led intelligence, then that may be the tipping point that brings the much vaunted MaaS benefits into the mainstream. That's what we could do if everyone had the means to benefit. So how do we use all this to encourage true inclusivity? Firstly, we have to put the customer at the core of the passenger transport industry. Work hard to understand their real needs and to ensure the maximum numbers of people understand their options. Secondly, the more efficient and well used any service is, the more flexibility there will be to make fares attractive and affordable for everyone. And the increasing powers of government in directing the bus and train markets will be very welcome in pushing this along. Thirdly, make services as transparent and easy to understand as possible, remembering that not everyone will be accessing that information through an app. Fourth, give people manageable and realistic options for paying for their transport. Make sure everyone understands that contactless payment is available to everyone, and there are options that allow people to top up prepaid contactless cards in just the same way as a mobile phone account. And lastly, returning to the customer as the center of what we do, invest time and money in understanding what communities need and how best to spread economic advantage. We've created the precedents with more central control of rail and the bus back better strategy. Let's keep that going and not leave large numbers of people behind who are the very ones we are as a society trying to help. Thank you very much.